The fire had burned low to embers when Olivia Foster first saw him through the frosted window, a shadow against the white expanse that stretched endlessly beyond her cabin door. Three women had already fled this cursed valley before the first snow, packing their meager belongings and disappearing into the night like smoke. But the man standing motionless in her yard bore the marks of someone who had nowhere left to run. His face was a map of violence, purple bruises blooming across his left cheek, a split lip that had crusted over with dried blood. His coat hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of more damage beneath. Yet he stood with a strange dignity, as if the beating he had endured had stripped away everything except some essential core that refused to bend. Olivia pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched him. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would trap them both for days, perhaps weeks. She had seen men like him before, broken things seeking shelter, and she had learned the hard way that kindness was a luxury she could not afford. The valley had earned its reputation honestly. No woman stayed past the first snow. The isolation, the brutal winters, the way the mountains seemed to close in like the walls of a tomb, it drove them away one by one. Olivia had watched Hannah Myers pack her wagon in September, tears streaming down her face as she loaded the last of her possessions. Judith Green had lasted until October, but the loneliness had eaten at her like a disease until she could no longer bear the sound of wind through empty rooms. Now December had arrived with its teeth bared, and Olivia remained, not by choice but by circumstance. Her husband Samuel Miller had died 3 months ago, leaving her with debts that chained her to this place as surely as iron shackles. The land was worthless, the cabin barely standing, but it was all she had left in the world. The man in her yard swayed slightly, and she realized he was close to collapse. Blood had frozen in dark streaks down his neck, and his breathing came in visible puffs that spoke of ribs that might be cracked or broken. Whatever had happened to him, whoever had done this, he was running out of time. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. She stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to let the storm take him rather than risk bringing violence into her home. But something in his stillness, in the way he simply stood there without demanding entry or calling out for help, gave her pause. The wind gusted again, and she watched him brace against it. He did not look toward the cabin with the desperate hunger she had seen in other men's eyes. Instead, he seemed to be gathering himself, preparing to move on despite his injuries. There was something almost noble in his refusal to beg, something that reminded her of Samuel in his final days, proud even as the fever consumed him. Olivia wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to the door. Her fingers hesitated on the latch, and she found herself thinking of Richard Phillips, the man who owned most of the valley now, who had made it clear that her debts would soon come due. Phillips had a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl, and she knew that when spring came, if she survived the winter, he would expect payment in forms that had nothing to do with money. The thought of Phillips decided her. If she was going to face wolves, better to choose which ones entered her den. She lifted the latch and opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. "You are injured," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. The man turned slowly, as if the movement caused him pain. Up close, she could see that his injuries were even worse than she had first thought. His left eye was swollen nearly shut, and there were cuts on his hands that spoke of a fight where he had given as good as he got. "I am," he said simply. His voice was rough, whether from cold or damage to his throat she could not tell. "I was hoping to make it to the next settlement, but the storm came faster than expected." There was no next settlement, not for 50 miles in any direction, and certainly not through the mountain passes in weather like this. He had to know that, which meant he was either lying or desperate enough to attempt the impossible. "What is your name?" she asked. "Adam Reyes," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he was not entirely sure she would want to know. The name meant nothing to her, but names rarely told the whole truth anyway. She studied his face, looking for signs of the madness that sometimes took men in the wilderness. The desperate cunning of someone who would do anything to survive. Instead, she saw exhaustion and pain, and beneath that, something that might have been resignation. "I have little to offer," she said carefully. "Food is scarce, and fuel for the fire even scarcer." "I do not ask for charity," Adam replied. "I can work for my keep if you have need of repairs or other tasks. My hands are steady enough, despite appearances." It was a reasonable offer, perhaps too reasonable. Men who made such bargains often had hidden prices that revealed themselves only after it was too late to refuse. But as she looked at him standing in the snow, she found herself thinking not of the dangers he might represent, but of the long winter nights ahead. The silence that pressed against the walls like a living thing. The way her own voice sounded strange to her ears after days without speaking. "There is a barn," she said finally. "It is not much warmer than outside, but it will keep the wind off you." Adam nodded, a gesture that seemed to cost him considerable effort. "That is kind of you." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Olivia said, though she was not entirely sure why she felt the need to make that clear. "I simply do not wish to find a frozen corpse in my yard come morning." Something that might have been a smile flickered on across his battered features. A practical concern. She watched him make his way slowly toward the barn, noting how he favored his left side and the way his breathing hitched with each step. Whatever had happened to him, it was recent. The blood was still bright in places, and some of his wounds had not yet begun to properly heal. As she closed the door and returned to her fire, Olivia found herself wondering who had beaten him so thoroughly, and why. In her experience, men who looked like Adam Reyes, men who carried themselves with that particular blend of strength and wariness, did not end up broken and bleeding without good reason. Either he had crossed someone powerful, or he had stood up for something that others thought he should have left alone. Neither possibility boded well for her own safety. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the windows and finding every gap in the cabin's construction. She added another log to the fire, knowing she could not afford to waste fuel but unable to bear the thought of the cold creeping closer. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment she imagined she could see faces in the patterns, the ghosts of all the women who had fled this place before her. Hannah Myers had been the first to go, packing her belongings in the middle of the night and leaving only a brief note explaining that she could not bear another winter alone. Judith Green had lasted longer, but the isolation had slowly driven her to distraction. She had taken to talking to herself, carrying on elaborate conversations with people who existed only in her memory. When she finally left, she had been muttering about voices in the wind, about the way the mountains watched her with hungry eyes. Cheryl Mendoza had been different. She had not fled from loneliness or fear, but from something more concrete. Olivia had seen the bruises on her arms, the way she flinched when men raised their voices. Richard Phillips had been particularly attentive to Cheryl, offering to help with her husband's debts, suggesting arrangements that would benefit them both. When Cheryl disappeared one October morning, Phillips had been notably angry, as if something that belonged to him had been stolen. Now Olivia was the only woman left in the valley, and she could feel Phillips's attention turning toward her like the beam of a lighthouse, steady and inescapable. He had visited twice since Samuel's death, ostensibly to discuss the debts her husband had left behind, but his eyes had lingered on her in ways that made her skin crawl. The second time, he had been more direct, suggesting that there were ways she could work off what she owed, arrangements that would be mutually beneficial. She had refused, of course, but they both knew it was only a matter of time. When spring came and the debts came due, she would have to choose between Phillips's proposition and losing everything. And losing everything meant facing the world with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever coin she could scrape together from selling the few possessions Samuel had not already mortgaged. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, she could hear the storm intensifying, the wind driving snow against the windows with increasing force. It would be a long night, and longer still if Adam Reyes proved to be something other than what he appeared. She rose and checked the bar across the door, testing its strength. It would hold against most threats, but she had learned not to trust entirely in locks and barriers. Samuel had taught her to shoot before he died, pressing his old rifle into her hands and making her practice until she could hit a target at 50 yards. The weapon now rested loaded above the mantelpiece, within easy reach if she needed it. As she settled back into her chair by the fire, Olivia found her thoughts returning to the man in her barn. There had been something in his manner, a quality she could not quite name, that suggested he was not entirely what he seemed. The way he had stood in her yard, motionless and patient, spoke of someone accustomed to waiting, to watching. And his offer to work for his keep had been made with the confidence of someone who knew the value of his own skills. Most men who found themselves beaten and homeless carry themselves with the desperate energy of the truly desperate. They begged or demanded, threatened or pleaded, but they did not simply stand in the snow and wait to see what mercy might be offered. Adam Reyes had done exactly that, and the more she thought about it, the more it troubled her. The storm continued to rage outside, and she knew that whatever his story, whatever had brought him to her door, they were bound together now until the weather cleared. In this valley, in this season, there was no escape from the choices one made. The mountains saw to that, trapping people with their own decisions until spring came to set them free. She thought of Phillips again, of the way he had smiled when she refused his offer, as if her resistance was merely a temporary inconvenience. He owned most of the valley now, had been buying up land and debts for years, consolidating his power until he was effectively the law in these parts. The few men who remain, Zachary Thomas and Jonathan Roberts among them, worked for Phillips in one capacity or another. They would not stand against him, not for her, not for anyone. That left her alone with her debts and her pride, neither of which would keep her warm through the winter or fed through the spring. Samuel had been a good man, but he had been a poor businessman, trusting where he should have been cautious, generous where he should have been calculating it. His debts were a legacy of kindness that would likely destroy her. The irony was not lost on her. She had taken in a stranger tonight, offered shelter to a man who might well prove to be a threat, and she had done it for the same reasons that had doomed her husband. Perhaps kindness was a weakness she could not afford, but it seemed she could not escape it either. A sound from outside made her freeze, a noise that was not quite the wind, not quite the natural settling of wood and stone. She rose quietly and moved to the window, peering out through the frost-covered glass. The barn was barely visible through the driving new snow, but she could see a faint glow from within, as if Adam had managed to start a small fire of his own. As she watched, a shadow moved past the barn door, too large and too purposeful to be Adam Reyes. Her blood turned to ice as she realized there was someone else out there, someone moving with the careful stealth of a hunter stalking prey. She backed away from the window and reached for the rifle above the mantelpiece, her hands trembling as she checked the load. Whatever was happening in her barn, whatever had brought Adam Reyes to her door, it was not over. The beating he had endured was not the end of his troubles, merely a pause in whatever conflict had marked him so thoroughly. The wind masked most sounds, but she thought she heard voices, low and urgent, coming from the direction of the barn. At least two men, possibly more, and their presence here in the middle of a blizzard suggested they had followed Adam's trail with grim determination. Olivia pressed herself against the wall beside the window, the rifle clutched in her hands, and tried to decide what to do. She could bar the door and wait, hoping that whatever business these men had was with Adam alone. Or she could act, though what action she might take against unknown numbers in a storm was far from clear. The choice was made for her when she heard the barn door slam open, followed by shouts that cut through the wind like knives. There was a crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, and then a cry of pain that was unmistakably human. They had found him. The sounds from the barn grew more violent, punctuated by voices raised in anger and the dull thud of blows landing on flesh. Olivia knew she should stay inside, should let whatever was happening run its course without involving herself. Adam Reyes was a stranger, and his troubles were not her own. But as she listened to the sounds of violence, she found herself thinking of Samuel, of the way he had always stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves. It had been his greatest virtue and his fatal flaw, the quality that had made her love him and ultimately led to the debts that now threatened to destroy her. The barn door slammed again, and she heard footsteps in the snow, multiple sets moving with purpose toward her cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that whatever these men wanted, they were not content to settle it with Adam alone. A heavy fist pounded on her door, making the entire cabin shake. "Open up," a voice called, rough with cold and something that might have been drink. "We know you are in there, and we know you have something that belongs to us." Olivia pressed her back against the wall, the rifle steady in her hands despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She recognized the voice now, though she had hoped never to hear it again. Zachary Thomas, one of Phillips's men, a brute who took pleasure in other people's pain. "There is nothing here that belongs to you," she called back, proud that her voice remained steady. "The man in your barn would disagree," Thomas replied. "Adam Reyes has something that does not belong to him, and we have come to collect it. Send him out, and we will be on our way." Through the window, she could see shapes moving in the darkness. At least 3 men arranged around her cabin. They had not come alone, and they had not come unprepared. This was not a chance encounter or a simple pursuit. It was a trap, carefully laid and expertly sprung. "I do not know what you are talking about," Olivia said, though she suspected that was no longer entirely true. Whatever Adam Reyes had done, whatever he had taken or witnessed or refused to give up, it had brought violence to her door just as surely as if she had invited it in herself. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," Thomas said, and she could hear the threat beneath his words. "We know he is here, and we know you gave him shelter. That makes you part of this, whether you want to be or not." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. By opening her door to Adam Reyes, by offering him even the meager shelter of her barn, she had made herself a player in whatever game was being played. There would be no neutral ground, no way to claim innocence or ignorance. She was committed now, for better or worse. Another voice spoke up, one she did not recognize, but which carried the authority of command. "We can do this easy or hard, woman. Your choice, but one way or another, we are taking Reyes with us tonight." The wind howled around the cabin, driving snow against the windows with renewed fury. In the barn, she could hear more sounds of violence, punctuated by what might have been Adam's voice raised in defiance or pain. Whatever he had done to earn such attention, he was paying for it now. But as Olivia stood there with the rifle in her hands, listening to the sounds of brutality and the promises of more to come, she found herself thinking not of Adam Reyes and his unknown crimes, but of all the women who had fled this valley before her. Hannah Myers and Judith Green and Cheryl Mendoza, all of them running from different forms of the same essential threat. Men who took what they wanted and called it justice. The pounding on her door resumed, more insistent now, and she knew that her time for choosing was running out. Whatever happened next would define not just this night, but everything that came after. She could surrender Adam Reyes and hope that would be enough, or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences followed. Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them all in this moment of decision, and Olivia Foster realized that for the first time since Samuel's death, she was no longer simply surviving. She was about to fight. The rifle felt heavier in her hands than it had any right to, the metal cold enough to burn her palms even through the calluses Samuel's death had left her with. Through the frosted glass, she could see Thomas moving closer to the door, his bulk unmistakable, even in the swirling snow. Behind him, 2 other figures maintained their positions, boxing her cabin in like hunters surrounding wounded prey. "Last chance, woman," Thomas called, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed other people's fear. "Send out Reyes, or we come in and take him ourselves. Either way, you do not want to be standing between us and what we came for." Olivia pressed herself against the wall beside the door, mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in blood. The bar across the door was solid oak, but it would not hold against determined men with the right tools. The windows were too small to climb through, and even if she could manage it, there was nowhere to run in weather like this. From the barn came another crash, followed by what sounded like Adam's voice raised in pain or defiance. Whatever they were doing to him, it was methodical, designed to break him down piece by piece rather than simply kill him outright. That suggested they needed something from him, information or an object he carried, something valuable enough to risk hunting him through a blizzard. "You have 10 seconds, Thomas shouted, and she heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. "Then we start making holes in that door until you see reason." The threat crystallized something in Olivia's mind, a clarity that cut through fear like a blade through cloth. She had spent 3 months since Samuel's death living in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for spring to come and seal her fate, accepting that her choices had been reduced to different forms of surrender. But standing here with violence at her door, she realized that surrender itself was a choice and she was tired of making it. "The man in my barn is under my protection," she called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You want him. You go through me first." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had crossed a line now, committed herself to a course of action that would have consequences far beyond this single night. Richard Phillips would hear of this, would know that she had defied his men, and there would be a reckoning for that defiance. But as she waited for Thomas's response, Olivia found herself thinking not of Phillips or his threats, but of Cheryl Mendoza's bruised arms, of the way Hannah Myers had wept as she loaded her wagon, of all the women who had fled this valley rather than stand and fight. Perhaps they had been wiser than she was being now. Perhaps survival was worth any price, even dignity. The first shot shattered the silence like thunder, splintering wood near the doorframe and sending fragments flying across the cabin. Olivia threw herself to the floor, clutching the rifle as another shot followed, this one punching through the door itself and embedding in the far wall. "That was a warning," Thomas bellowed. "Next ones go lower, and we keep shooting until you change your mind or run out of places to hide." She crawled toward the window, staying below the line of sight, and peered out through the bottom corner of the glass. Thomas had moved closer, confident now that he had the upper hand, while his companions maintained their positions. In the barn, she could no longer hear sounds of struggle, which might mean Adam was unconscious or worse. Another shot rang out, and this time she heard glass breaking in the kitchen. They were not trying to kill her yet, just making it clear that her shelter was no protection against their determination. The message was simple enough: surrender or watch everything she had left be destroyed around her. But as she lay there on the cold floor, listening to the wind howl through the bullet holes in her door, Olivia felt something she had not experienced since Samuel's death. Not peace exactly, but a kind of fierce satisfaction in having finally chosen a side. Whatever happened now, she would not have to live with the knowledge that she had stood aside while evil was done in her name. The barn door slammed open again, and through the storm she could see figures emerging, dragging what looked like Adam's limp form between them. He was conscious but barely, his head hanging forward as they hauled him through the snow toward her cabin. Blood left a dark trail behind them, already being covered by fresh snowfall. "Look what we found," Thomas called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Your guest was not very cooperative, but we convinced him to see reason eventually. Now you can watch what happens to people who try to help him." They dropped Adam in the snow, perhaps 20 feet from her door, close enough that she could see his chest rising and falling, close enough to hear his labored breathing over the wind. His face was worse now than when she had first seen him, new bruises layered over old ones, but his eyes were open and aware. "Here is how this works," Thomas continued, his rifle trained on Adam's prone form. "You have something we want, or you are protecting someone who does. Either way, we are taking him with us when we leave. The only question is whether you make us burn down your cabin to get him." Through the broken glass, she could see one of Thomas's companions moving around the side of the cabin, carrying what looked like a torch. The threat was not idle. They would burn her out if necessary, force her to choose between the flames and the cold. But as she watched Adam lying motionless in the snow, something in his posture caught her attention. His hands were positioned strangely, not the random sprawl of an unconscious man, but something more deliberate. Following his gaze, she realized he was looking not at the cabin, but at something beyond it, toward the tree line where the darkness was deepest. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. There was someone else out there. Someone Adam could see, but Thomas and his men could not. The beating in the barn had not been the end of the conflict, but merely one battle in a larger war, and now that war was about to engulf her cabin. "Time's up," Thomas announced, raising his rifle. "Last chance to be reasonable." The shot that answered him came not from Olivia's cabin, but from the darkness beyond the barn, a sharp crack that sent Thomas spinning into the snow. His companions whirled toward the sound, their own weapons coming up, but they were too late. More shots followed in rapid succession, muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars in the storm. Olivia pressed herself against the floor as bullets whined overhead, punching through her walls and sending splinters raining down around her. The battle that had found Adam Reyes had finally caught up with him, and her cabin had become the center of a war she did not understand. Through the chaos, she could hear voices shouting orders, could see figures moving through the snow with military precision. These were not random bandits or Phillips's usual thugs, but something more organized, more dangerous. They moved like soldiers, covered each other's advances, communicated with hand signals when words would not carry over the gunfire. Adam was moving now, rolling through the snow toward her cabin despite his injuries. A bullet kicked up dirt near his head, but he kept coming, driven by desperation or determination or both. Whatever side he was on in this conflict, he had chosen her cabin as his sanctuary, and that choice was about to cost them both everything. The front door exploded inward as someone kicked it off its hinges, the oak bar snapping like kindling under the assault. Olivia swung her rifle toward the opening, finger tightening on the trigger. But the figure that stumbled through was Adam himself, blood streaming down his face and one arm hanging useless at his side. "Get away from the windows," he gasped, throwing himself against the wall beside her. "They have the cabin surrounded, and they are not here to take prisoners." Before she could respond, the remaining glass in her kitchen window shattered as someone fired through it. The bullet passed close enough to her head that she felt the wind of its passage, close enough to remind her how quickly life could end in a place like this. "Who are they?" she whispered, though she was not sure why she bothered to lower her voice when bullets were flying overhead. "Phillips's men," Adam replied, his breathing labored, "but not the usual ones. He brought in professionals for this, men who know how to fight a war." The implications of that hit her like a physical blow. If Phillips had hired professional killers, if he was willing to go that far to get whatever Adam possessed, then this was about more than simple debts or territorial disputes. This was about power, about control, about the kind of stakes that made human lives expendable. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin, systematic and methodical, designed to keep them pinned down while the attackers repositioned. Through the broken door, Olivia could see muzzle flashes moving in a coordinated pattern, closing the circle around her home like a noose drawing tight. "What did you take from him?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "What is worth all this?" Adam's laugh was bitter, tinged with pain and something that might have been regret. "I did not take anything. I saw something Phillips thought no one would ever witness. Now he needs to make sure I never tell anyone about it." The shooting stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind and the crackle of flames from somewhere outside. Through the broken windows, Olivia could smell smoke, acrid and thick, mixing with the clean scent of snow. They were burning something, perhaps the barn, perhaps preparing to burn the cabin itself. "Reyes!" a voice called from outside, different from Thomas's rough tones. This one was cultured, educated, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you can hear me. This has gone far enough. Come out now and the woman lives. Stay hidden, and I burn this place down around both of you." Adam closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he might be considering surrender. But when he opened them again, she saw not defeat, but a kind of grim determination that reminded her of Samuel in his final days, facing death with dignity intact. "Richard Phillips," he said, loud enough to carry through the broken door, "I should have known you would come yourself when your dogs proved insufficient." "You always were too clever for your own good," Phillips replied, his voice moving closer. "But cleverness only takes a man so far when he is outnumbered and outgunned." Through the doorway, Olivia could see a figure approaching through the snow, tall and well-dressed despite the weather. Richard Phillips moved with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed, who had never encountered a problem that money or violence could not solve. Behind him, she could make out at least 4 other men, all armed, all watching the cabin with professional alertness. "You saw something in town 3 weeks ago," Phillips continued, stopping just outside effective rifle range. "Something that could cause me considerable inconvenience if it became public knowledge. I am prepared to be generous in exchange for your discretion." Adam's response was immediate and final. "No." The single word hung in the air between them, simple and absolute. Whatever Phillips was offering, Whatever threats he was prepared to make, Adam Reyes had already made his choice. He would not be bought, would not be intimidated, would not compromise with the kind of power that Phillips represented. "I thought you might say that," Phillips said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "You always were an idealist." "It is an admirable quality, but not a practical one." He gestured to his men, and they began moving again, spreading out to surround the cabin completely. The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and through the kitchen window she could see orange light dancing against the trees. They had set fire to something upwind, and the flames were spreading despite the snow. "Mrs. Foster," was called, his tone becoming almost conversational. "You have found yourself in an unfortunate situation through no fault of your own. I bear you no ill will, and I have no desire to see you harmed. Walk out now, and you have my word that you will be allowed to leave unharmed." Olivia looked at Adam, seeing the resignation in his eyes. He expected her to take the offer, expected her to choose survival over principle. It was the sensible choice, the practical choice, the choice that every other woman in this valley had made when faced with Phillips's power. But as she knelt there on the floor of her cabin, surrounded by the debris of her former life, she found herself thinking not of survival, but of dignity. Samuel had died with his principles intact, had refused to compromise with men like Phillips even when it cost him everything. Perhaps that was a legacy worth preserving, even if it meant sharing his fate. "I think not," she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the broken door. "This is my home, and Adam Reyes is under my protection. If you want him, you will have to come through me." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant crackle of flames. She had committed herself now, had chosen sides in a conflict that would likely end in her death. But for the first time since Samuel's funeral, she felt truly alive. Truly herself, no longer simply reacting to circumstances, but actively shaping them. Phillips's response when it came carried the weight of finality. "So be it. I had hoped to resolve this without unnecessary bloodshed, but you have made your choice. Jonathan, prepare the charges." Charges. Olivia felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what that meant. Phillips was not content to simply burn them out or wait for them to surrender. He was planning to blow up the cabin, to end this siege with overwhelming force that would leave no survivors and no witnesses. "How long do we have?" she whispered to Adam. He was listening intently to the sounds from outside, his head cocked like a hunting dog scenting prey. "Not long, maybe 10 minutes to set the charges properly. Less if they are willing to risk bringing down the whole structure at once. 10 minutes. Not enough time to escape, not enough time to fight their way out, barely enough time to make peace with whatever choices had brought them to this moment." But as she looked at Adam's battered face, at the determination that still burned in his eyes despite everything he had endured, Olivia realized that peace was not what she wanted. She wanted to fight. "The root cellar," she said suddenly, remembering the small space Samuel had dug beneath the kitchen floor to store vegetables through the winter. "It connects to the old mine shaft that runs under the hill. If we can reach it before the charges go off." Adam's eyes sharpened with interest. "How far does the shaft go?" "I do not know. Samuel explored it once, said it went back maybe 100 yards before collapsing. But there are side passages, places where the miners followed different veins. If we could get into the tunnel system." It was not much of a plan, but it was better than waiting to be blown apart. The root cellar was accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor, hidden beneath a heavy wooden cabinet that Phillips's men might not notice in their haste to plant explosives. "Can you move?" she asked, noting the way Adam favored his injured arm. "I can move," he said grimly. "The question is whether we can do it quietly enough to avoid drawing attention." Outside, she could hear Phillips's men working, their voices low and professional as they went about their deadly business. One of them was definitely near the kitchen window, close enough that any sudden movement would be spotted immediately. But as they prepared to make their desperate attempt, another sound reached them through the storm, faint but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast despite the snow and darkness. Someone else was coming, someone Phillips had not expected. The working sounds outside stopped abruptly, replaced by urgent voices and the metallic click of weapons being readied. Through the broken door, Olivia could see Phillips himself turning toward the sound, his confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Sir," one of his men called urgently, "riders coming from the south. At least 6, maybe more." Phillips cursed, a sound that carried clearly through the wind. Whatever he had planned, whoever was approaching, their arrival had complicated his calculations. The charges were not yet set, the cabin not yet destroyed, and now he faced the possibility of witnesses to whatever he had intended to do here. "How long until they arrive?" Phillips demanded. 5 minutes, maybe less, in this snow." Olivia felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by reality. Whoever was coming might not be allies, might be more of Phillips's men or simply travelers unlucky enough to stumble into a war zone. But their arrival had bought precious time, had forced Phillips to recalculate his approach. "Change of plans," Phillips announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to adapting quickly to changing circumstances. "We take them alive if possible. I need to know what Reyes has told her, what she might have seen or heard. Kill the riders when they arrive. Make it look like they were caught in crossfire." The casual way he ordered murder, as if human lives were simply obstacles to be removed, sent a chill through Olivia that had nothing to do with the cold. This was what Phillips truly was beneath his veneer of civilization, a man who would kill anyone who threatened his power or profit. But his change of plans had also revealed something else, something that might be the key to their survival. He needed them alive, at least temporarily, which meant the immediate threat of explosion had passed. They had time now, not much, but enough to attempt an escape that might actually succeed. "The cellar," Adam whispered urgently. "Now, while they are distracted." Moving as quietly as possible, they crawled toward the kitchen, staying below the window line and avoiding the patches of floor where broken glass might crunch underfoot. The cabinet that concealed the trapdoor was heavy, but desperation gave them strength, and they managed to slide it aside without making noise that would carry over the wind. The trapdoor itself was swollen with moisture, reluctant to open, but finally yielded to their combined efforts. Below lay a small space, perhaps 6 feet square, filled with the earthy smell of stored vegetables and the musty dampness of underground places. At the far end, barely visible in the darkness, was the opening Samuel had broken through to connect with the old mine shaft. "You first," Adam whispered, but Olivia shook her head. "You are injured. If you get stuck, we both die." Before he could argue, she lowered herself through the opening, her feet finding the packed earth floor of the cellar. The space was cramped, forcing her to crouch, but she could see the mine entrance clearly now, a black opening that promised either salvation or simply a different kind of death. Adam dropped down beside her, his injured arm making him clumsy, but not stopping him entirely. Above them, they could hear Phillips's men moving through the cabin, searching for signs of their presence. It would not take long for someone to notice the moved cabinet, to realize what they had discovered. The mine entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and beyond it lay darkness so complete it seemed solid. But as they prepared to enter, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and with it came voices raised in challenge. "Phillips," someone called from outside, a voice Olivia did not recognize, but which carried obvious authority. "Stand down your men. This ends now." The response was immediate gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the storm as Phillips's professional killers opened fire on the approaching riders. But the newcomers were ready for the ambush, their return fire disciplined and accurate. Through the floorboards above, Olivia could hear Phillips cursing as his carefully laid plans dissolved into chaos. "Now, Adam whispered, and they plunged into the mine shaft, crawling on hands and knees through a space that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Behind them, the battle raged with increasing fury, but ahead lay only darkness and the unknown promise of whatever lay at the end of Samuel's tunnel. The shaft was longer than she remembered, twisting and turning as it followed the natural contours of the rock. Her hands found rough stone, rotting timber supports, and patches of mud that soaked through her clothes and chilled her to the bone. But they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that behind them lay certain death, and ahead lay at least the possibility of survival. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, they emerged into a larger space, a natural cavern where the miners had followed a rich vein of ore. Here they could finally stand upright, could breathe air that did not taste of earth and decay. "Which way?" Adam asked, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Olivia tried to remember Samuel's description of the tunnel system. The maps he had sketched on long winter evenings when the isolation grew too heavy to bear. There had been multiple passages, some leading deeper into the mountain, others emerging at different points along the valley floor. "There," she said, pointing toward what looked like the largest opening. "Samuel said that one led toward the river, comes out near the old mill foundation." They moved as quickly as Adam's injuries would allow, following the tunnel as it sloped downward into the heart of the mountain. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew fainter, muffled by tons of rock and earth. But ahead, carried on air currents that spoke of openings to the surface, came the sound of running water and the promise of escape. The tunnel ended abruptly at a wall of fallen rock, a cave-in that had sealed this passage years or perhaps decades ago. But to their left, barely visible in the darkness, was another opening, smaller than the main passage but clearly leading upward toward the surface. "This way, this way," Olivia said, though she was no longer certain of anything except the need to keep moving. The final passage was the worst yet, a crawl space that forced them to worm their way forward on their bellies, the weight of the mountain pressing down above them like a living thing. But gradually the darkness began to lighten, and the air grew fresher, carrying with it the clean scent of snow and pine. They emerged from the mountainside like creatures being born from stone, gasping and shivering in air that felt warm after the suffocating closeness of the tunnels. Behind them, perhaps a mile away, they could see the glow of fire against the storm clouds, could hear the distant crack of gunfire as the battle for the cabin continued. But they were free, at least for the moment, and as they stood there in the snow catching their breath, Olivia realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the widow Foster, trapped by circumstances and other people's choices. She had become something else, someone else, forged in the crucible of violence and decision. The question now was what came next, and as she looked at Adam Reyes standing beside her in the storm, she realized that whatever the answer might be, she would face it as herself, finally and completely herself, for the first time since Samuel's death. The mountain wind howled around them, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come, but also the possibility of survival, of choice, of a future written in her own hand rather than dictated by men like Richard Phillips. And in that moment, despite everything that had happened and everything that might yet come, Olivia Foster smiled. The smile faded from Olivia's lips as quickly as it had come, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They were alive, but barely, and the battle raging behind them meant that Phillips was still out there, still hunting, still determined to silence whatever truth Adam carried. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, but also making every step treacherous as they picked their way down the mountainside toward the valley floor. Adam moved beside her with the careful precision of a man who knew his body was failing him. The journey through the mine shafts had reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal, and she could see fresh blood seeping through his torn coat. But his eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness for threats, for opportunities, for whatever slim chance of survival the night might offer. "The mill," she said quietly, pointing toward a cluster of ruins barely visible through the storm. "We can shelter there until the fighting stops." He nodded, conserving his strength for the descent. The old mill had been abandoned for years, its wheel frozen and broken, but the stone walls would provide protection from the wind and concealment from anyone who might be searching for them. It was not much, but in their current circumstances, not much was better than nothing at all. They reached the ruins as the sounds of battle began to fade behind them, the gunfire becoming sporadic, then stopping altogether. Either the fight was over or it had moved elsewhere, but the silence felt ominous rather than reassuring. Phillips was not a man who gave up easily, and the arrival of unknown riders had complicated his plans without necessarily stopping them. The mill's interior was a maze of broken machinery and rotting timber, but they found a corner where fallen beams created a natural shelter. Olivia helped Adam settle against the stone wall, noting how his breathing had become labored, how his injured arm hung useless at his side. He needed medical attention, needed warmth and rest and food, none of which she could provide in this desolate place. "Tell me," she said, settling beside him in the darkness. "Tell me what you saw that was worth all this." Adam was quiet for so long she thought he might have lost consciousness, but finally he spoke, his voice barely audible over the wind that whistled through the broken walls. "3 weeks ago, I was in town on business, legitimate business, buying supplies for the winter. I saw Phillips meeting with a man I recognized, a federal marshal named Judith Sanders. They were arguing about something, voices raised enough that I could hear them from across the street." He paused, gathering strength to continue. The marshal was accusing Phillips of interfering with a federal investigation, of using his influence to protect someone who should have been arrested months ago. Phillips was offering her money, more money than a marshal would see in 10 years, to look the other way. Olivia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Federal marshals were not local law, not subject to Phillips's usual methods of control. If one of them was investigating activities in the valley, it meant Phillips's reach had extended far enough to attract attention from people who could not be bought or intimidated. "What happened then?" "She refused," Adam said simply. "Told him she had enough evidence to hang him and half his associates, that the only reason he was still free was because she needed more time to build an airtight case. Phillips got angry, started making threats, and that was when I knew I had to leave." But he had not left quickly enough. Phillips had seen him, had recognized the danger of a witness to his attempted bribery of a federal officer. In a territory where Phillips's word was law, where local judges and sheriffs danced to his tune, the testimony of one man might not matter. But in a federal court, with a determined marshal building a case, even one witness could be the thread that unraveled everything. "The marshal," Olivia said. "What happened to her?" Adam's silence was answer enough. Judith Sanders was dead, killed before she could complete her investigation, and now Adam was the only person who could testify to what she had discovered. No wonder Phillips was willing to hire professional killers, willing to burn down cabins and murder innocent women. The stakes were not just his local empire, but his very life. The wind outside began to die down, and with it came a new sound that made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving slowly through the snow, searching. Phillips had survived the battle, or at least some of his men had, and they were not giving up the hunt. "Stay here," Adam whispered, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "If they find us, I will lead them away. You have done enough." But Olivia was already moving, her hand closing around a piece of broken timber that might serve as a weapon. "We stay together," she said firmly. "I did not crawl through half a mountain to abandon you now." The hoofbeats were getting closer, accompanied by voices calling back and forth through the storm. They were conducting a systematic search, checking every building, every possible hiding place. It was only a matter of time before they reached the mill, and when they did, there would be nowhere left to run. Through a gap in the stone wall, Olivia could see torches moving through the darkness, at least 4 riders spread out in a search pattern. They moved with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was wounded, who understood that time was on their side. In weather like this, injured and exhausted, she and Adam could not hope to outrun mounted men. But as she watched the torches approach, something struck her as wrong. The riders were calling to each other, but their voices carried a tone she had not expected. Not the harsh commands of Phillips's killers, but something more urgent, more concerned. They were searching, yes, but perhaps not for the reasons she had assumed. "Adam," one of the voices called, clear enough to carry through the ruins. "Adam Reyes, if you can hear me, we are here to help. Marshal Sanders sent us before she died. We know what Phillips did, and we have come to get you out." Adam stiffened beside her, hope and suspicion warring in his expression. "Could be a trap," he whispered, but she could hear the longing in his voice, the desperate need to believe that rescue was possible. The voice came again, closer now. "We know about the federal investigation, about the evidence Sanders was gathering. We know Phillips tried to bribe her, and we know you witnessed it. We are here to get you to safety so you can testify." This time, Adam made his decision. Despite the risk, despite the possibility of betrayal, he called back, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Here, we are in the old mill. The response was immediate, hoofbeats converging on their location as the riders abandoned stealth for speed. Within moments, dark figures were silhouetted in the mill's broken doorway, their faces hidden by the shadows cast by their torches. Adam Reyes? The voice belonged to a woman, middle-aged and authoritative, carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Yes, Adam replied, struggling to stand straighter despite his injuries. Deputy Marshal Catherine Hayes, the woman said, stepping into the circle of torchlight. She was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. Marshal Sanders was my partner. She sent word about your situation before Phillips had her killed. The words hit Olivia like physical blows. Judith Sanders was indeed dead, murdered by Phillips or his agents, and now they were caught in the aftermath of that killing. But the presence of federal marshals meant that Phillips's power was not absolute, that there were still people willing to stand against him. The woman with you, Hayes continued, looking at Olivia with obvious concern. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Olivia said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. But Adam needs help. He has been beaten, shot at, and we spent hours crawling through mine shafts to escape. Hayes nodded to one of her companions, a younger man who immediately began examining Adam's injuries with practiced efficiency. We have a doctor waiting at our camp, she said. But first, we need to get you both away from here. Phillips is still alive, and he has more men coming. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night, too many horses moving too fast to be anything other than pursuit. Phillips had found their trail, had followed them to the mill, and now the final confrontation was at hand. How many men do you have? Adam asked, his voice tight with pain as the marshal's companion worked on his wounds. 4, counting myself, Hayes replied grimly. Phillips has at least twice that number, and they know this territory better than we do. The odds were not good, but they were better than facing Phillips alone. Olivia found herself thinking of all the women who had fled this valley, all the people who had chosen to run rather than fight. Perhaps they had been wise. Perhaps survival was more important than principle. But as she looked at Adam's battered face, at the determination in Marshal Hayes's eyes, she knew that running was no longer an option. There is another way out, she said suddenly, remembering something Samuel had told her years ago. The old logging road that runs along the ridge. It connects to the main trail about 5 miles north, but it is narrow, treacherous in weather like this. Hayes considered this, her tactical mind weighing options and probabilities. Could we reach it before Phillips cuts us off? Maybe, Olivia said, but we would have to leave now, and we would have to travel light and fast. The approaching hoofbeats were getting louder, and through the broken walls they could see torches moving through the trees. Phillips was close enough that they could hear his voice raised in anger, directing his men to surround the mill. Decision time, Hayes said, her hand moving to the rifle at her side. We can try for the logging road, or we can make our stand here. Adam tried to stand, grimaced, and settled back against the wall. I will not make it 5 miles on horseback, he said quietly. Not in this condition. But Olivia was already moving, her mind racing through possibilities that might give them a chance. The mill's water wheel was broken, but the mechanism that had once powered it was still partially intact. Heavy stones and iron gears that could be used as weapons, or as something else entirely. The dam, she said, pointing toward the structure that had once channeled water to the mill wheel. If we could break it, flood the approach road, it would slow them down, maybe trap some of them. Hayes followed her gaze, understanding immediately. The dam was old but solid, built to last by men who understood the power of moving water. But it had weak points, places where the right pressure applied at the right moment could bring the whole structure down. Explosives, Hayes asked. Or leverage, Olivia replied, indicating the heavy iron bars that had once been part of the mill's machinery. Samuel always said that dam was held together more by habit than engineering. The marshal made her decision with the speed of someone accustomed to life or death choices. Do it, she said, gesturing to her men. 2 of you help with the dam, 1 stays with Reyes. I will buy you time. But even as they began to move, Phillips's voice cut through the night, closer than before, and filled with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Hayes, he called, the name carrying across the ruins like a curse. I know you are in there. You are outnumbered and outgunned, and you are a long way from federal jurisdiction. Walk away now, and I will let you live. The marshal's response was immediate and uncompromising. Richard Phillips, you are under arrest for the murder of Deputy Marshal Judith Sanders and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Surrender now, and you will receive a fair trial. Phillips's laughter was harsh, edged with a kind of madness, yet came from absolute power corrupted, absolutely. A fair trial? In whose court? With whose jury? This is my valley, Hayes. My law runs here, not yours. But even as he spoke, Olivia and the other marshals were working frantically at the dam, using iron bars as levers to pry loose the stones that held back years of accumulated water and debris. The structure groaned under their assault, ancient mortar cracking, timbers shifting as the pressure behind them sought release. Almost there, one of the marshals whispered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. One more stone and the whole thing should go. Through the mill's broken walls, they could see Phillips's men positioning themselves, torches creating a ring of light around the ruins. He had brought at least 8 riders, all armed, all loyal to the man who paid their wages and protected them from the consequences of their actions. Against such odds, even federal marshals had limited options. But water, Olivia thought, water was a force that respected no authority, acknowledged no master. When the dam broke, it would not care about Philip's power or his threats. It would simply flow, carrying away everything in its path with the impartial violence of nature itself. The final stone came loose with a grinding crash that seemed to echo through the valley. For a moment, nothing happened, and Olivia feared their desperate plan had failed. Then, with a roar that drowned out all other sound, the dam collapsed, releasing a torrent of water that had been building pressure for decades. The flood hit Phillips's men like a physical blow, sweeping horses and riders downstream in a chaos of churning water and desperate cries. Some managed to reach higher ground, but others were caught in the current, their torches extinguished, their careful formations destroyed by the simple power of water seeking its level. In the confusion that followed, Hayes and her remaining men moved with practiced efficiency. They helped Adam to his feet, supported him as they made their way toward the horses they had left tethered on higher ground. The logging road was still their best chance of escape, and the flood had bought them precious time to attempt it. But as they prepared to leave, Olivia found herself hesitating, looking back toward the ruins of the mill, toward the valley that had been her home for so many years. Everything she had known, everything Samuel had built, was here in this cursed place. To leave meant abandoning not just property, but memory, not just a home, but an identity. Mrs. Foster, Hayes said gently, understanding her reluctance. There is nothing left for you here. Phillips will not forgive what happened tonight, and he has a long memory for those who cross him. It was true, of course. Even if Phillips survived the flood, even if he avoided federal prosecution, he would never forget that she had defied him, had chosen to protect Adam Reyes rather than submit to his will. There would be retribution, swift and merciless, and she would not survive it. But as she stood there in the snow, listening to the roar of floodwater and the distant cries of Philip's scattered men, Olivia realized that she was not the same woman who had opened her door to a beaten stranger hours ago. That woman had been trapped by circumstances, defined by other people's choices, resigned to a fate she could not control. This woman, the one who had crawled through mine shafts and helped destroy a dam, who had chosen principle over survival and defiance over submission, was someone new entirely. Someone who could face an uncertain future because she had finally learned to face herself. "I am ready," she said, and meant it. They rode through the night along trails that seemed to exist more in memory than reality, following paths that Samuel had shown her years ago when the world was simpler and the future seemed assured. The logging road was treacherous in the best of conditions, little more than a track carved into the mountainside by men who had needed to move timber down to the valley floor. In snow and darkness, with injured companions and pursuing enemies, it became a test of will as much as skill. Adam rode doubled with one of the marshals, his strength finally failing as the adrenaline that had sustained him through the night's ordeals began to fade. He drifted in and out of consciousness, held upright only by the man behind him, his breathing shallow and labored. But he was alive, and that was more than any of them had dared hope hours earlier. Behind them, the valley lay in darkness, the floodwaters gradually receding to reveal the damage they had wrought. Phillips might have survived, might even now be organizing pursuit, but his power had been broken as surely as the dam. Word of the night's events would spread, would reach federal authorities who could no longer ignore what was happening in this remote corner of the territory. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale colors that seemed impossibly delicate after the violence of the night, they reached the main trail that led to the territorial capital. Here they would find help, medical attention for Adam, protection from Phillips's remaining influence. Here, the long nightmare of the cursed valley would finally end. But as they paused to rest the horses and check Adam's condition, Marshal Hayes pulled Olivia aside, her expression serious. "What you did back there," she said quietly. "Helping us, risking your life for a man you barely knew. It took courage. The kind of courage this territory needs more of." Olivia looked back toward the valley, toward the mountains that had imprisoned her for so long. "I did what had to be done," she said simply. "Nothing more." "Perhaps," Hayes replied, "but I have seen too many people do less when more was needed. The federal government is establishing new settlements, places where people like you can start over, build something better than what came before. If you are interested." The offer hung in the air between them, a possibility Olivia had never dared to imagine. A chance to begin again, to build a life based on her own choices rather than other people's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime, if at all. "What about Adam?" she asked, looking toward the injured man who had brought such case and change into her carefully ordered world. Hayes smiled, the first genuine warmth she had shown since their meeting. "He will testify, help us put Phillips away for good. After that," she shrugged, "men like Adam Reyes do not settle easily, but they do settle eventually, usually when they find something worth staying for." The implications of that statement were not lost on Olivia, but she found she was not ready to examine them too closely. Too much had happened, too much had changed, for her to make sense of it all in a single night. But as she looked at Adam's still form, at the man who had refused to leave her fireside, even when it meant facing death, she felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought died with Samuel. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that even in the darkest places, even in valleys where no woman stayed past the first snow, human connection could bloom like wildflowers in spring, unexpected and resilient and beautiful beyond measure. The sun climbed higher, burning away the storm clouds and revealing a world transformed by the night's events. The valley behind them would never be the same, would never again be the domain of one man's twisted vision of power. And she, Olivia Foster, widow of Samuel Miller, survivor of the Cursed Valley, would never again be the woman who had opened her door to a stranger in the snow. She had become someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of choosing her own path rather than simply enduring the path chosen for her. It was a transformation born of necessity and forged in violence, but it was real and it was hers, and no one could ever take it away from her. As they prepared to resume their journey, Adam stirred, his eyes opening to meet hers across the space between their horses. He was still weak, still injured, but there was something in his gaze that spoke of shared understanding, of recognition between two people who had faced the worst and somehow found the best in themselves. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple meaning. "Thank you," she replied, and knew that he understood what she meant. Not just gratitude for his presence in her life, but acknowledgement of what they had given each other. He had shown her that she was capable of more than survival, and she had shown him that there were still people worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth staying beside, even when the world demanded otherwise. The trail ahead was long and uncertain, leading toward a future neither of them could predict or control. But they would face it together. These two survivors of the valley where no woman stayed past the first snow, bound by shared experience and the quiet recognition that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for territory or treasure, but for the simple right to choose one's own destiny. Behind them, the mountain stood eternal and indifferent, witnesses to human struggles that seemed insignificant against their ancient grandeur. But in the hearts of two people riding toward an uncertain dawn, those struggles had meaning beyond measure, had transformed not just their own lives, but their understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. The beaten one had refused to leave her fireside, and in doing so had given her something she had never expected to find again. Not just companionship, not just protection, but the recognition that she was worth fighting for, worth staying beside, worth the kind of loyalty that could survive anything the world might throw against it. And as they rode toward whatever future awaited them, Olivia Foster smiled again, this time without reservation, without fear, without the shadow of doubt that had haunted her since Samuel's death. She was free at last, free to choose, free to love, free to build whatever life she could imagine for herself. The valley behind them would heal, would find new inhabitants, would perhaps even prosper under better leadership than Richard Phillips had provided. But it would never again hold the power to trap anyone the way it had trapped her, because she had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the only way out was through, and sometimes the strength to go through came not from within, but from the unexpected kindness of strangers who refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, safer, more sensible. The beaten one had stayed, and in staying had set them both free.